There is a moment, just before the first chopper rises, when the battlefield goes silent, not from peace nor from fear, but from the raw weight of something impossible to ignore, the presence of an orc. You feel it before you see him, a pressure in the air like a distant storm clawing its way closer, carried by the scent of iron, oil, and old violence. Then the roar comes, rolling over the horizon like a living tide, thick with the promise of broken worlds and burning sky. To live as an orc is to breathe war, to dream in the rhythm of gunfire, and to greet dawn with the grin of something born to fight. If you want to step deeper into that world, to feel its pulse, its fury, its feral joy, you can lend strength to this channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. It keeps the engines running, and it keeps the stories marching forward. The ground was warm when I rose from it, as if the soil itself remembered the fires that had once scorched its surface. At first there was no shape to the world, only a thick, pulsing haze that clung to my skin like damp smoke. My eyes, still new and unsure of their purpose, blinked against a half-light that flickered with hints of movement. The air tasted of minerals and rust, a tang that settled on my tongue and told me, without teaching, that something in the distance was worth walking toward. My limbs twitched before my thoughts formed. Instinct was older than I was, older than anything that still lived on this battlefield. The earth around me shuddered with the memory of footsteps that had passed long before I pushed free, and each vibration tugged at me, urging me forward with a rhythm etched deep into who I was. The first breath was thick with moisture, carrying a smell like old blood buried beneath layers of dirt. It filled my lungs in a heavy rush, and with it came a sensation of pressure behind my ribs, not just the beating of a new heart, but the weight of an instinctive command. There was noise somewhere ahead, not words, not music, but something clattering, metal on metal, fractured echoes of conflict. The sound curled its fingers around me, pulled me upright, and I stumbled toward it with a body that already knew how to move. Muscles shifted under green skin as if remembering routines I had never lived. My hands clenched and unclenched, craving something solid, something that could be used to strike. Even the shape of my jaw felt made for biting, for roaring, for tearing into something that resisted. I did not know my name because I did not need one. Identity arrived not through thought but through the rigidity of bone, the weight of muscle, the rough texture of skin that had grown tough without ever having faced the burn of an enemy's blade. The mud clinging to me was still wet from the growth spurt that had carried me from spore to form, but even as it slid down my arms, my mind drifted to hunger not for food, but for motion, for challenge, for the strain of effort against something that pushed back. The hum under my skin sharpened with each step, thrumming through my bones like a drumbeat, slow enough to feel but fast enough to urge me on. If I paused too long, the world seemed to lean in around me, whispering that I was meant to keep moving. My first real sight was a sky heavy with smoke, its colors bruised and restless. Clouds drifted in thick patches, broken apart by sudden gusts of wind that carried flecks of ash through the air like drifting flakes of black snow. Somewhere beyond those clouds, something bright pulsed in a distant rhythm I could feel more than see, but it had no meaning for me yet. What mattered was the ground, uneven, carved by old tracks left by machines long since broken, littered with scraps of metal that gleamed dully beneath layers of grime. I ran my fingers along the slagged edge of one such piece, feeling the warped heat shape of a weapon's last scream before cooling. It sent a throb through my hand, a half-memory from some ancestor who might have once held something like it in the middle of a charge. When I lifted the scrap to the light, it caught on something that shone faintly, a hint of red paint, peeling and cracked, but still clinging stubbornly to the metal. It meant nothing, yet it stirred something. Red meant speed. It meant motion. I didn't know how I knew, but the knowledge settled into me with the certainty of a truth carved into bone. I swung the piece of scrap through the air, testing its weight, savoring the whistle it made as it cut the space in front of me. My fingers tightened around it naturally, as though they had been waiting for this moment. The world sharpened around the edges, the haze fading as purpose aligned inside my skull, like gears clicking into place. The sound I had been following grew louder, not one noise, but several layered together. Clanks, thuds, low rumbles, and a deeper growl that vibrated in the center of my chest when I drew close enough. Shapes began to emerge through the smoke, crude structures hammered together from scavenged metal, their silhouettes crooked yet brimming with life. Sparks leapt from somewhere within them, brightening the interior shadows with sudden flashes of orange. I felt my lips pull back in a grin I didn't realize I could make, a grin that bared my teeth at the simple sight of motion. Something was happening there, something I understood without needing explanation. The scrap in my hand felt suddenly inadequate, yet comforting. As I moved closer, the figures revealed themselves big, loud, rough forms hunched over machinery and jagged piles of metal. Their movements were heavy but purposeful, each one radiating a confidence so physical it warped the air around them. Their skin was the same green as mine, but theirs carried scars, cracks, and patterns of grime that told stories of fights survived. When they turned toward me, their eyes glimmered with interest rather than suspicion, and that interest warmed something deep within me. I wasn't intruding, I was arriving. One of them laughed, a booming sound that rattled the loose plates of metal nearby, and in that laugh there was welcome. The biggest of them sauntered forward, the ground trembling with each step. His presence filled the world like a thunderhead rolling in, dark and immense. He stopped in front of me and tilted his head, studying me with a scrutiny that felt like a physical touch. His grin spread slow and wide, revealing teeth chipped from old brawls. There was something almost reverent in the way he looked at the scrap weapon in my hand, as if recognizing in it the first spark of a story. He jabbed a thick finger at my chest, let out a grunt of approval, and turned his back to me as though confident I would follow. And I did. There was no question. His stride carved a path, and I stepped into that path as though it had been meant for me all along. Inside the crude shelters, the air was thick with smoke and the metallic tang of oil. Tools clattered rhythmically, not with precision but with enthusiasm, as if each blow of a hammer was a celebration rather than a task. Massive gears clunked in awkward harmony, powered by rattling engines that belched black fumes from crooked vents. Sparks spat and hissed where welders kissed metal, scattering tiny embers that died on the floor in faint sizzles. Every sound here sang of creation, but creation not for beauty or craft, creation for battle. Even the machines seemed alive, restless beasts eager to roar into motion and tear across the land. A smaller figure, though still taller and broader than anything human, pointed at me, then at a pile of mismatched metal plates. The gesture was sharp, commanding. Without being told why, I stepped forward and began to sort through the pile, drawn by some inner compass that knew which pieces belonged together. I stacked them, tested their balance, tapped them to listen for the solid ring that meant strength. The others watched, their expressions approving, as though my actions confirmed something they had already expected. When I lifted two plates and slammed them together with a satisfying clang, a ripple of laughter moved through the shelter. The act was simple, but I felt pride bloom in my chest like a spark landing on dry tinder. Those moments blurred into a rhythm of motion, hammering, lifting, stacking, testing, moving again. Sweat rolled down my skin, mixing with dust until my hands were slick with grime, but the work felt good, purposeful, grounding. Every clang echoed through me, forming a cadence that steadied the hum inside my skull. The older orcs glanced at me occasionally, one of them shouting a word I couldn't yet parse, but understood to mean something close to proper. Their acceptance wasn't gentle or kind, but it was real. It wrapped around me tightly, a crude but unbreakable bond forged through shared momentum. As darkness crept across the sky, outside, the shelter grew warmer with the glow of machines. The shadows jerked across the walls as engines sputtered to life, coughing out fumes that filled the space with a familiar burn. I felt a tug inside me again, stronger this time, a pull toward something beyond the shelter, beyond the clatter and sparks. The world outside was shifting, filling with a distant tremor that made my skin prickle. I stepped out, drawn by the vibration, and the others followed with eager grins, as though they too felt the approaching momentum. The land beyond the camp stretched wide, broken by the ruins of old machines, twisted metal, and shattered stone. The tremor grew louder, rising from the ground in a rolling wave, almost musical in its deep-throated thunder. Something large was approaching, not danger, not threat, but promise. When the shapes finally appeared on the horizon, they were enormous, lurching forward with crude engines belching flame. Their wheels were jagged, their armor mismatched, their structures towering like moving forts of metal. They carried orcs on their backs, shouting and waving crude weapons in the air as they barreled toward the camp with gleeful roars. The sight rooted me to the ground. I felt something inside my chest burst open, not fear, not confusion, but recognition so powerful it shook me. Those machines, those roaring figures, that rolling unstoppable momentum, it was the answer to the hum in my bones. It was the meaning of the pull that had guided my steps since the moment I had risen from the soil. It was everything I had been built for. The biggest machine screeched to a halt near the camp, its metal plates rattling like laughter, and the orcs aboard it leapt down in heavy thuds. One of them, wearing armor adorned with jagged glyphs, stomped forward and let out a roar that split the air like a bolt of lightning. The roar hit me hard enough to shake loose every lingering fog in my mind. In that moment, everything aligned. My purpose, my hunger, my instinct. The roar was a call, and I was its answer. Without thinking, I raised my scrap weapon into the air and roared back. My voice cracked on the first attempt, but surged on the second, rising until it blended with the shouts of the mob around me. The sound washed over the camp in a wave, chaotic yet unified, each individual voice shaping the greater whole. My heart pounded in a fierce new rhythm, matching the roar, syncing with the machine engines, joining the rising heat in the air. The big orc who had first welcomed me thumped his fist against my shoulder hard enough to jolt me forward, his grin wide and wild. He pointed at the massive machines, at the distant horizon beyond them, and at the hum in the air that promised nothing but battle. I understood. Every orc understood. This was not merely a gathering. It was the beginning of something vast and unstoppable. It was the world opening its jaws to reveal endless conflict, and I was ready to fling myself into its teeth. The machines revved, engines snarling, and the orcs began to climb aboard. My legs moved before thought, carrying me toward the nearest platform. When my hands closed around the metal railing, a jolt of belonging surged through me so sharply it almost hurt. I pulled myself up, found a place among the others, and felt the whole contraption lurch as the engines roared to life. The ground trembled beneath the machine's weight, and the horizon beckoned with the promise of battle waiting somewhere just out of sight. As the machine thundered forward, wind whipping past my face and the roar of the mob vibrating through my bones, I realized the truth of my existence. I had been born from soil and instinct, but I lived for this: the momentum, the noise, the promise of combat. The world rushed toward us as if eager to meet the fury we carried. Chapter 1 ends as the machine barrels into the unknown, the first taste of true war burning in my lungs like a second breath, and the horizon ahead glowing with the promise of Crumpin yet to come. The machine's roar swallowed the world as we rolled across the torn plain, its crude wheels biting into the soil with a hunger that matched my own. The air rushed past in ragged gusts, carrying the scent of old smoke and distant fire, a reminder that something out there was waiting for us, something that would push back. My fingers tightened around the jagged scrap weapon I still carried, its weight familiar now, almost comforting. The metal beneath my grip was rough and uneven, warmed by the heat of the machine's engines. Each vibration from the grinding gears sank into my bones, stoking the restless energy inside me until it coiled like a storm looking for a place to break. Around me the mob roared, every voice joining the next in a rolling tide of noise that shook the rattling plates of the vehicle. Their laughter was sharp and violent, a joyous howl that rose higher each time the machine jostled us over broken ground. Sparks flew from the exhaust pipes, trailing behind us, like burning embers cast off from a forge too eager for its own fire. The sky above seemed to lean closer, heavy with dark clouds that swirled as though drawn to the rising energy. Even without words, without thought, I knew this thunderous ride was leading toward my first real fight, the first test of everything in me that was awake and boiling. The engine's pitch shifted suddenly, climbing to a fevered whine as the driver, a broad, wild-eyed orc with a grin carved deep into his scarred face, slammed a heavy boot onto the accelerator. The machine lurched violently forward, sending the mob gripping tighter to the railings. I braced instinctively, feet widening to absorb the impact, my muscles sinking with the motion like I had done this 100 times before. Ahead, the land sloped downward into a valley carved from old explosions. Smoke drifted from several points along the ridge, and the faint outlines of structures flickered through the haze like broken teeth jutting from the ground. The driver bellowed something unintelligible but triumphant, and the mob erupted in response. My pulse hammered beneath my skin, the rhythm matching the pounding of the machine's wheels. Every nerve in my body felt lit, electric, as though the world itself had entered me and ignited everything within. The valley grew clearer with each passing heartbeat, revealing barricades of rusted metal, slagged fortifications, and the jittering movement of creatures scrambling across the ground. Their shapes were spindly, pale against the dark soil, and they darted behind cover with frantic haste. They were smaller than us, thinner, and their movements lacked weight, yet something in their motions carried the sharpness of fear mixed with determination. The first shots cracked through the air without warning. Bright streaks of energy sliced past the front of our machine, carving glowing scars into the metal. The mob shouted in exhilaration rather than alarm, raising their crude firearms and blasting wildly into the haze with explosive bursts of noise. The scent of scorched air filled my nostrils as I ducked instinctively beneath a volley that flashed inches above my head. Sparks rained across the deck of the machine, and the driver let out a bark of laughter that seemed to challenge the incoming fire to hit him directly. The sight of those streaking bolts awakened something fierce inside me, something that clenched my muscles tighter and sharpened my senses until the world seemed to slow. My vision focused on the figures scrambling across the valley floor. They wore tattered gear and leaned into makeshift positions, firing jittering weapons with hands that shook either from fear or excitement. Their shots were desperate, pulsing erratically through the air, lacking the heavy certainty of orc craftsmanship. But it didn't matter. They were shooting at us. They were fighting. And that meant I had something to answer. The machine hit a sharp dip and slammed upward again, and I nearly lost my grip as I steadied myself. The sudden jolt launched us through a cloud of smoke, and the valley fully opened before us. The pale creatures clustered around their crude defensive line, yelling to one another in voices too thin to matter. Some carried jittering blades that sparked when they clashed together. Others clutched rifles that spat weak streaks of light. In their eyes I saw the flicker of fear, but also something else, a resolve that would make their resistance worth the effort it took to break it. The driver roared one final challenge and jerked the machine hard to the right, bringing us into striking distance. Before the wheels had even fully slowed, the mob around me surged forward with weapons raised high. They leapt from the machine with explosive bursts of motion, landing in heavy thuds that cracked the ground beneath them. Their voices split the air, loud enough to drown the sound of enemy fire. My heart thrashed against my ribs, and the humming energy inside me reached its peak. Without hesitation, I followed. The ground rushed up as I leapt, and when my feet hit, the impact sent a shudder up my legs that steadied me more than it jarred me. Dust exploded around my boots, and the world snapped into sharpness. The screams of the pale creatures pitched upward as the mob crashed into their defensive line. Blue flashes burst from their rifles, slicing through the dust with desperate intensity. One beam struck the orc to my left, scorching a path across his shoulder. He roared in delight, as if the pain confirmed something he'd been hoping for. The scrap weapon in my hand felt suddenly heavier, fuller, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The first creature rushed at me, swinging its sparking blade in a wide arc that crackled through the air. I moved without thinking, my body tilting just enough to let the blade whistle past. The creature's momentum carried it forward, and before it could recover, I brought my weapon down. The impact rang through my arms in a satisfying jolt, the metal biting into bone with a resistance that lasted only a heartbeat before collapsing beneath the force. The creature hit the ground in a tangle of limbs, its weapon clattering out of reach. A second came immediately, voice shrill as it jabbed its rifle toward me like a spear. I batted it aside with a heavy swing that sent the rifle spinning away. The creature staggered, and I stepped into the opening, driving my shoulder into its chest with a force that folded it backward. It hit the ground hard, dust rising in a cloud around its fallen form. Something inside me surged at the sight, not cruelty, not triumph, but the exhilarating confirmation that this was where I belonged, where all the noise inside me finally became clear. The mob's roars echoed across the valley as more orcs crashed into the defensive line, scattering the pale creatures with overwhelming force. Some of the defenders tried to retreat, scrambling toward the far ridge, but the mob chased them with relentless enthusiasm. Gunfire erupted in chaotic bursts, mixed with metal clashes and the guttural snarls of orcs sinking into the joy of combat. Every sound, every motion around me felt like it was part of a greater rhythm, a harsh, pounding melody that pushed me deeper into the fight. One of the larger creatures appeared ahead, its gear heavier, its movements more disciplined than the others. It raised a sturdier rifle, firing a volley that scorched the air around me. I ducked behind a jagged metal barrier, feeling the heat of the shots as they tore into the edge of cover. The creature advanced with steady steps, its eyes hard and focused, lacking the panic of the others. It moved like someone who had fought before, who expected to win through precision rather than brute force. It fired again, each shot controlled, each bolt aimed with intent. I moved as the shots streaked toward me, rolling across the dirt, and rising to my feet in one motion. I felt the heat of a bolt skim my arm, leaving a burning line across my skin. The pain was sharp, bright, and invigorating. I surged forward with renewed focus, rushing the creature before it could correct its aim. It tried to fire at point-blank range, but I slammed my scrap weapon into the rifle, knocking its barrel upward. The bolt shot harmlessly into the sky. The creature stumbled back, but I pressed forward, each step heavy with purpose. It swung the rifle like a club, catching the side of my head and sending a burst of light across my vision. The impact drove me sideways, but my grip on my weapon tightened. With a snarl, I lunged, swinging downward with all the strength in my arms. The metal struck the creature's armor, cracking the plates with a jarring explosion of force. The creature crumpled beneath the blow, sinking into the dust with a gasp that vanished into the din of battle. The world around me blurred into a storm of motion, the mob pressing forward, the defenders breaking, the valley shaking beneath the combined weight of violence and momentum. A sudden explosion burst to my right, sending dirt and scrap metal flying. Fragments rained down around me, clattering against the ground. The pressure wave knocked me sideways, and for a moment I tasted grit and smoke as the air filled with harsh, ringing silence. Then the noise crashed back in, a roar from one of the orcs as he charged through a cluster of defenders, the scream of a machine gun rattling from the ridge, the crackle of burning debris crunching under my boots as I pushed myself upright. My muscles trembled with effort, but the tremor only fed the hunger surging through me. Every part of me demanded more impact, more challenge, more of the sensation that sharpened the world until nothing else mattered. The defenders were scattering now, breaking formation and fleeing toward the far end of the valley. The mob surged after them with delighted roars, chasing their retreat like a pack of predators running down wounded prey. I sprinted forward, each stride carrying me deeper into the thrill of the chase. The ground blurred beneath me, and the air tore past my ears with a howl that matched the one rising in my throat. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate. I simply followed the pull inside me, the instinct that grew brighter with every moment of pursuit. One defender stumbled as it ran, tripping over a broken metal plate embedded in the ground. It hit the dirt hard, scrambling to rise. I closed the distance in an instant. It turned, lifting its weapon with trembling hands, but before it could aim, I slammed into it with the full force of my momentum. The impact drove it backward, its weapon skidding out of reach. I brought my scrap weapon down in a single swift blow, ending its struggle. As I stood over the fallen creature, chest heaving, sweat mixing with dust on my skin, the valley seemed to settle around me. The sounds of the fight shifted, still loud, still chaotic, but shifting toward victory. The mob was driving the last of the defenders toward the ridge, pushing them into disarray. Some of the defenders were dropping their weapons, others screaming as they were overwhelmed. The tide had turned fully, and the air felt charged with triumph. The big orc who had first welcomed me barreled past, roaring with laughter as he smashed into a group of retreating defenders. He swung his massive hammer in wide arcs, each strike sending bodies flying through the air. His joy was infectious, rolling across the battlefield like a shockwave. I felt my own grin widen, my pulse steadying into the fierce rhythm of victory. The last defender fell beneath the mob's advance, and the valley grew still at last. Smoke drifted lazily upward from burning debris, and the air hummed with the aftermath of violence. The mob gathered near the center of the valley, voices rising in celebration, some pounding their chests, others slamming their weapons into the ground in triumph. I stood among them, the scrap weapon still warm in my hand, and felt something settle inside me. Not peace, never peace, but certainty. The valley was quiet now, but my veins still thrummed with the electrifying aftermath of the fight. My first fight, my first crump. And as the mob lifted their voices again, calling for another battle, another ride, another test of strength, I felt the answer rise inside me before thought could form. The hunger had not been satisfied. It had only awakened. We turned toward the machines, engines rumbling with eager heat, and as we climbed aboard once more, I felt the momentum building again, carrying me toward whatever waited beyond the ridge. The first fight was over, but the next was already calling. The engines growled like hungry beasts as we rumbled away from the valley, carrying the scent of dust, sweat, and burnt metal with us. The machine rocked beneath my feet as it clawed up the ridge, its wheels grinding through loose stone and scattered debris left behind by battles older than any of us. The sun hung low across the horizon, bleeding red light through the smoke that drifted lazily over the wasteland. Every orc aboard the machine vibrated with the afterglow of the fight, the thrill still echoing through our limbs as if refusing to fade. My muscles buzzed with that same electricity, the memory of impact still fresh in my bones. But beneath the fire of victory, something else simmered, a sense that I was no longer just a single body moving through the world. I had become part of something larger, heavier, louder. The mob gathered around me in a loose circle, shoving at each other with rough laughter, their voices carrying the same tone they had used during the fight. Not anger, not suspicion, recognition. One of the broader orcs slapped his hand against my back hard enough to jolt my teeth together. His grin was a jagged line of cracked enamel, and his eyes gleamed with approval. Without needing words, I understood what the blow meant. I had stepped into their rhythm. I had earned that place through blood and motion. That was how a mob measured worth, not through talk, but through the sound you made when you hit the ground and the noise you left behind afterward. The machine lurched again as we reached the top of the ridge. The wasteland below spread into a vast expanse broken by jagged metal formations, rusted machine husks, and long, winding scars carved into the earth. The horizon trembled with heat and smoke, making distant shapes warp and distort. Somewhere out there, more enemies waited, though their faces didn't matter. What mattered was the promise of movement, the promise of challenge. But before that future could unfold, something immediate commanded my attention. The boss moved toward me. Even among orcs, who were towering and broad by nature, the boss stood apart. His armor was a patchwork of plates thick enough to stop a tank shell, each piece crudely bolted together with spikes jutting in aggressive angles. A massive iron jaw encased his lower face, clicking with every step like a mechanical beast hungry for violence. The scars across his skin told stories more jagged than any glyph, and his eyes burned with a fire that didn't dim even between battles. His walk was heavy, deliberate, each step commanding the mob without needing a word. The others pushed apart to make room, their postures shifting in subtle acknowledgement. The hum of the engine faded beneath the weight of the boss's presence. When he stopped in front of me, the air grew thick. He towered over me, his shadow swallowing the red glow of the sun. The metal jaw clicked once more as he leaned in, studying me with an appraisal sharp as a blade's edge. My muscles tightened instinctively, though not out of fear. Fear didn't fit into the shape of what I was. This was something else. Anticipation, challenge, readiness. For a long moment he said nothing. The only sounds were the clatter of the machine, the hiss of overheating pipes, and the low murmurs of the mob watching us. Then, in a voice that rumbled from deep within his chest, the boss growled a single word that felt more like a verdict than a greeting. I didn't know its exact meaning, but I understood it perfectly. It was acceptance, it was acknowledgement, it was the confirmation that I was no longer a stray body clawed from the dirt, but a part of his mob. The boss slammed his heavy fist against my chest, not enough to truly wound me, but enough to shake the air from my lungs, and the mob erupted into roaring laughter. The blow was a rite, a branding of sorts, rough but genuine. My grin spread across my face before I could stop it. The boss's approval pulsed through me like a second heartbeat, each thud syncing with the rumble of the machine beneath us. The world felt sharper again, clearer, anchored by this new bond. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the machine veered eastward, carrying us toward a cluster of jagged structures rising in the distance. Smoke billowed from chimneys welded haphazardly to towers made from scavenged metal plates and immense gears. The stench of oil thickened in the air as we approached. This was no random outpost, this was a camp, built by orcs for the purpose of movement, noise, war, and the constant churn of machinery. When we rolled into its outskirts, orcs of all sizes turned toward us. Some were covered in soot from working on engines. Others hefted massive crates, each filled with parts that clinked and rattled with raw potential. A few stood atop rusted platforms, hammering on makeshift anvils that produced showers of bright sparks. Everywhere I looked, motion thrummed through the camp as though it breathed with metallic lungs. No one was idle. Idleness meant silence, and silence had no place in this world. The machine skidded to a halt near a roaring bonfire surrounded by barrels, crates, and the gutted carcasses of machines that had died in loud, chaotic glory. The mob leapt down eagerly, shouting greetings to the orcs already present. Weapons were raised, new tales were shouted across the fire, and old grudges rekindled in friendly brawls that ended with laughter and bruises. I followed them down, the earth firm beneath my boots, the fire's heat licking at my skin. A young orc, though still older than me, if age meant anything among us, approached with 2 crude mugs made from hollowed-out metal shells. He shoved one into my hand without ceremony. The liquid inside sloshed thickly, smelling of fermenting fuel mixed with something pungent and alive. I didn't question it. I drank. The taste was brutal, burning through my throat and settling heavily in my stomach, but it warmed me pleasantly. The orc who had handed it to me grinned, revealing missing teeth and a scar down one side of his face. He thumped his mug against mine in a gesture that meant fellowship, then disappeared into the crowd. The fire crackled loudly as logs and bits of scrap metal were tossed into the flames. Sparks shot upward, swirling with the smoke that drifted toward the night sky. Around the fire, orcs laughed, argued, boasted, fought, and celebrated. It was not chaos. It was harmony born from noise. Their voices layered over one another in a rhythm that felt ancient, familiar. They shouted tales of battles I had not been part of, battles fought in fields of burning wreckage, on the hulls of stolen machines, or in the shattered husks of old cities. Each story surged with action and carnage, retold with pride and embellished with details that grew more spectacular with every retelling. I listened not for the details, but for the cadence of their voices, the way the mob moved as one organism made of many. When one orc shouted, others answered. When one laughed, the laughter spread like wildfire. When one threw down a challenge, the mob shifted eagerly, forming a loose circle around the 2 brawlers. I watched as fists collided with jaws, as bodies crashed heavily to the ground, and as both combatants rose again with grins wider than before. Victory mattered, but so did the fight itself. A good brawl tested the sinews, sharpened the instincts, and reminded everyone why they existed in the first place. An orc in heavy armor approached me, his shoulders draped with chains taken from wrecked vehicles. His tusks were chipped from countless fights, and his left eye was a glowing red orb that flickered with mechanical life. He tilted his head at me, studying my stance, my weapon, the fresh marks of battle across my skin. Then he jabbed a finger at an open patch of dirt and stepped back with anticipation. I understood the invitation immediately. The mob formed a loose ring around us, their voices rising in a chorus of excited roars. The heat from the fire washed over my back as I stepped into the center. The armored orc cracked his knuckles loudly, then rushed me with a burst of force that stirred the dust. I braced myself and met his charge head-on. The impact rattled my bones, sent a tremor up my legs, but I held my ground. Our grips locked, muscles straining as we pushed against each other with equal fury. The noise of the mob blurred into a single pounding heartbeat in my skull. We grappled, shifting our weight, testing each other's strength. The armored orc twisted suddenly, wrenching my arm backward. Pain shot through my shoulder, bright and sharp. But pain did not weaken me, it sharpened me. I dropped my weight, swung low, and knocked his legs out from under him. He crashed into the dirt, the impact shaking loose the dust beneath us, but he rose again instantly, grinning wide, and lunged forward with renewed vigor. The fight lasted longer than I expected. Each blow he landed sent a shockwave through my muscles, but each blow I returned made something inside me grow fiercer. The mob's roar grew louder with every exchange, a thunderous encouragement that fueled us both. When at last I caught him off balance and slammed him into the dirt hard enough to leave a crater, the ring erupted in roaring approval. The armored orc looked up at me with a grin that cracked his scarred face even wider, then clapped his hand against my forearm in a gesture that meant more than any spoken praise. The brawl ended not with victory claimed, but with connection forged. As the night deepened, the bonfire grew larger. More orcs joined the circle, some still bleeding from minor wounds they wore with pride. Food was tossed into the flames until the smell of roasting meat mingled with the scent of oil. Tools clanged in the distance as mech boys tinkered with rattling engines, their laughter echoing into the darkness. Somewhere, a group of orcs began chanting, their voices rising in a rhythmic beat that made the air vibrate faintly. I found myself drawn toward the center of the gathering, where the boss sat atop a massive metal crate, his posture commanding even in rest. He watched his mob with a gaze that took in everything, the fights, the laughter, the building, the boasting. His presence was like a forging hammer, shaping the mob's identity. He did not need to speak for his authority to settle over the camp like a heavy mantle. When his gaze settled on me again, I felt the weight of it. Not oppressive, but grounding. He gestured for me to step forward. I obeyed. When I stood before him, he reached out with a massive hand and pressed something into my grip, a weapon, heavier and more solid than the scrap I had carried since birth. It was a crude axe, its blade chipped and stained, its handle wrapped with strips of metal and hide. It had weight, history, purpose. The boss nodded once as I took it, and that single gesture burned itself into my memory. Around us, the mob cheered, not loudly this time, not in frenzy, but in a rumbling unity that felt sacred. With that axe in my hand, I was no longer just part of the mob. I was bound to it, rooted in it, defined by it. When the fires dimmed and the camp's noise dipped to a quieter rumble, I felt the world shift again. The horizon pulsed with distant promises of war. The engines simmered, hungry. The mob was ready, and so was I. Night wrapped itself around the camp like a heavy cloak, but inside that darkness, the fires of unity burned bright. The next step was waiting. The next battle was coming. The next chapter of life in the mob was about to begin. The night after the celebration settled into a dense, oil-scented quiet, broken only by the rumble of engines cooling beneath tarps stitched from salvaged metal plates. Smoke curled upward in lazy spirals from the bonfires, glowing faintly red against the darkness like embers breathed out by some slumbering metal beast. The camp did not sleep. Orcs never truly slept, but it shifted, slowing into a restless stillness. Even in that quiet, something pulsed beneath the surface. Not sound, not movement, something deeper. A tension, a hum, a shape without shape. At first I thought it was nothing more than the lingering echo of the fight, the memory of battle clinging to the edges of my thoughts. But when I closed my eyes, I felt it again, a low vibration running up the length of my spine, buzzing behind my teeth, faint but insistent. It wasn't the thrum of engines, nor the crackle of fading fire. It felt older, hungrier, like the energy that had guided my first steps through the dust, magnified now into a presence hanging in the air around me. I sat on a rusted heap of old armor plating overlooking the camp, watching the mech boys hammer on chattering contraptions that sparked and sputtered with manic life. The sparks flared brighter than the machines themselves, dancing in the dark like tiny pieces of lightning. A weird boy stood near them, tall and lanky, his skin stretched tight over twitching muscles. His staff glowed faintly, flickers of green light crawling up its surface like veins. He muttered to himself, head jerking in sudden spasms, as though listening to whispers only he could hear. The hum inside me flared whenever he twitched. I clenched my new axe, feeling its weight settle me back into the world of metal and fire. The edge glimmered faintly in the firelight, as if eager for the next battle. But even the anticipation of the fight to come couldn't fully drown out the sensation crawling along my nerves. It felt like standing too close to a static charged fence just before lightning struck, as though something was watching, not with eyes, with hunger. I brushed the feeling aside at first. Orcs didn't dwell on thoughts that didn't lead to battle. But when I rose and made my way toward the center of the camp, the hum followed. It grew stronger as I approached the bonfires, even though their noise should have drowned out everything. Several orcs were gathered around a patch of dirt where two boys were grappling in a friendly brawl. They stopped when I passed, lifting their chins in acknowledgement. But even among their roaring energy, the vibration didn't fade. Something deeper than the mob's noise was alive tonight. The boss sat on his massive crate near the bonfire, tuning the huge shooter he carried. Sparks flew as he tightened bolts with his bare hands, metal squealing in protest. His presence usually silenced whatever uncertainty lingered in the mind. But when I approached, the hum grew stronger, like a drumbeat. Trying to climb out of the ground itself, the boss lifted his gaze toward me, eyes narrowing in a silent question. I bowed my head slightly, a gesture I never thought I understood until that moment. Something inside me tightened, as if bracing for impact. The weird glow from the mech boy's corner flared suddenly, bright enough to wash the camp in a sickly, pulsing green. Every orc paused for the briefest second, not out of fear, but instinct. The weird boy threw back his head and howled, his voice cutting through the night like a jagged blade. His entire body arched, legs trembling, arms rigid as an unseen force surged through him. Green lightning crackled from his staff, leaping across the ground and snaking toward the bonfire in erratic coils. The boss grunted, not surprised, not concerned, merely acknowledging that the strange moment had arrived. Weird boys were unpredictable, conduits for some storm of energy none of us could see but all of us could feel. The hum inside me surged, brighter, more tangible, as though answering the lightning that danced through the air. The weird boy's howl softened into broken muttering. His staff clattered to the ground. A few orcs laughed, others whistled, but I couldn't tear my gaze from him. For a heartbeat, his eyes locked with mine, and something in them shivered, something wild, unhinged, yet strangely aware. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. His lips moved, shaping words that felt too slippery to catch. Then he whispered something that made the hum spike hard enough to rattle my teeth. "Wow, it's coming." His voice stretched on the last word, each syllable trembling as though carried on a gust of charged wind. The orcs around him roared in amusement, shoving him back toward the mech boys as he regained his footing. But I stood frozen, the word echoing in my skull. Wah! I didn't know its full meaning, not yet, but I knew instinctively it was more than a shout, more than a chant. It was movement, it was pressure, it was the tide rising before a storm broke. The hum settled slightly, dimming to a faint tremor again, but the feeling didn't leave. The next morning, the camp burst into a frenzy. Orcs rushed to and fro, dragging immense plates of metal, hammering crude armor into shape, mounting weapons onto vehicles that belched smoke even when idle. The light of the rising sun glinted off jagged edges and gleaming rivets. It was the kind of fury that preceded war. Yet beneath the clangs and roars, I felt the whisper again, the faint crawling sensation that wound its way up my spine. A mechanical clatter echoed across the camp as a deaf dread was wheeled out from a workshop, its claws snapping erratically, fueled by some combination of engine roar and the mech boys' cackling excitement. The sight stirred a wild grin across my face, but even that noise couldn't fully drown the whispering tremor brushing against the inside of my skull. I walked among machines, the preparations, the shouts and brawls. The mob greeted me as one of their own, some punching my shoulder, others offering weapons to test, or bits of scrap to evaluate, but their camaraderie, their warmth fierce and rough as it was, couldn't shield me from the invisible pressure growing thicker by the hour. It came strongest when the mob gathered. We assembled near the center of the camp, weapons slung across our backs or resting in eager hands. Engines revved, flames roared. The boss climbed onto a mound of rusted armor plates, his voice rising above the thunder of the crowd without effort. He shouted not words of strategy or caution. Orcs needed neither, but a booming declaration that sent a surge of fire through our veins. His roar sharpened the mob's energy until it vibrated in the air like an unsheathed blade. The hum inside me flared again, threading itself through the mob's roar, weaving into the thunder of voices. It was no longer a distant vibration. It pulsed, it throbbed, it matched the rhythm of the shouting orcs around me. Each roar fed it, strengthened it, shaped it. I felt it blooming behind my eyes, swelling like something that wanted to burst. The weird boy staggered forward as the roar rose, clutching his staff as if to anchor himself. Green lightning flickered at the edges of his gaze, crawling across his skin like veins full of liquid fire. He lifted his head slowly, his lips trembling as he tried to speak over the fury of his own body. The Wa was stirring, not fully, not consciously, not like a deity or a creature watching from beyond the sky. Orcs didn't think like that. But it was there, rising in the noise, in the unity, in the fire of anticipation. Rumors whispered through the galaxy that something connected orcs, something older and stranger than flesh and bone. Whether those rumors were truth or superstition never mattered to orcs. They felt what they felt, and right now, I felt it like a storm, building beneath my ribs. The roar reached its peak, bursting outward like an explosion. Fire surged upward from the bonfires, catching the wind and scattering sparks. The weird boy convulsed, lightning peeling off him in bright green arcs that danced between weapons, machines, and bodies without burning them. His voice rose in a wail that was part agony, part ecstasy, part something else entirely. The hum inside me snapped, not breaking, but connecting. Suddenly, everything sharpened. Not just sight, not just sound. The world itself felt thicker, more alive. Every orc's breath vibrated against my own. Every heartbeat around me felt like it pulsed from within my chest. The grind of engines buzzed not just in my ears, but through my blood. The boss's bellowed commands felt as though they came from somewhere deep within me. The world blurred at the edges, tethered together by a single, unbroken thread of energy. Then it passed. Sudden as it came, the clarity snapped back into the dull warmth of everyday noise. The camp churned on. The orcs moved with their usual chaotic purpose. The weird boy sagged against his staff, breathing hard but laughing through his exhaustion. The air cooled around us, but something inside me did not settle. Even in the quiet moments after the roar faded, the soft whisper remained. It wasn't a voice, nor a thought, just a presence. A pressure, a promise. I didn't understand it, or perhaps I did, just not with words. It was the Wa, not as a god, not as a mind, not as some cosmic being watching over us, but as a current, a tide, a rising force born from the unity of motion, violence, noise, and hunger for the next battle. The boss gave the order to move out, and engines roared to life once more. The mob surged toward the machines with eager steps, laughter rising like thunderclouds building across the landscape. I climbed aboard with them, the hum beneath my skin pulsing like a heartbeat out of sync with my own. Something had awakened beneath the noise of the mob, and whatever it was, it had noticed me. The horizon ahead vibrated with promise as we rolled forward into the thickening smoke. The whisper followed. The machines thundered across the wasteland as dawn bled into the sky like a wound opening over the horizon, painting the clouds in streaks of bruised orange and faint, sickly green. Smoke clung low to the ground, coiling around the wheels as they crushed stones to powder and sent shards of rusted metal skittering in all directions. The mob was louder than the engines, their roars, their laughter, their arguments, their brawling. Every orc around me moved with the kind of restless excitement that shook the air itself, a tension wound tight in their muscles, eager to be unleashed. Yet beneath all of that noise, beneath the raw weight of our momentum, the hum still pulsed, subtler than before, but deeper. It threaded through the vibrations of the machines, tugging at me like a signal buried beneath chaos. The axe in my grip felt heavier now, though not from fatigue. Its weight had changed, or perhaps my understanding of it had. It no longer felt like a simple tool of violence. It felt like a piece of the world itself, forged from the noise and fury surrounding me. Every time I flexed my fingers around its handle, the hum ticked brighter in my bones, as if something inside the weapon answered something inside me. I didn't know if the others felt it too, or if their minds were too consumed by the immediate thrill of the coming battle to notice anything else. Orcs rarely worried about unseen things, unless those unseen things promised a fight. The boss stood near the front of the biggest machine, one boot planted on a jutting panel of metal, one massive fist gripping a mounted gun that rattled as the machine rolled. Wind tore at the edges of his armor, carrying flecks of dust and ash that clung to his jaw of iron. His stance was steady, unshaken by the rumbling terrain. When he glanced back at the mob, his eyes burned with a certainty so fierce it could have carved through steel. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to order. His presence alone shaped the mob's energy, guiding it like a blade guided by a wielder's hand. The horizon changed as we approached it. Shapes emerged from the haze towers of twisted rebar, half-collapsed manufactorum ruins, the shells of vehicles long since abandoned by whatever had once driven them. Some buildings still sparked with flickers of old power, their broken lights blinking like dying stars. Others leaned at precarious angles, groaning when the wind blew through their hollow interiors. The ground itself seemed uneasy, cracked in wide patterns like scars left by some immense creature's claws. The hum pulsed again, stronger this time. I clenched my axe and felt the vibration trickle up my arm, settling behind my eyes like a growing pressure. It was not painful, but it was persistent. It pulled, it watched, it waited. Ahead of us, streaks of energy burst upward, gunfire, scattered and frantic. Figures scrambled among the ruins, pale and thin like the ones we had fought before, but more, numerous now. They moved quickly, ducking into cover, their weapons firing weak, jittering beams that faded before reaching us. Their shouts carried on the wind, high-pitched and frantic, drowned beneath the roar of our engines. The mob erupted in laughter, raising their weapons high in anticipation. Bullets clattered in metal magazines, blades scraped against each other. The smell of oil thickened as the machines accelerated, tearing up chunks of earth in their eagerness. Every orc leaned forward as though the horizon were a magnet pulling us toward its heart. But beneath that rush, I heard something else. A crackle, a low, simmering whisper. A resonance that didn't come from the engines or the wind or the gunfire. It rode beneath everything, a hidden current that flicked against the edges of my thoughts. Not a voice, not words, just pressure. As though the world itself were gathering breath in anticipation. The weird boy perched on the far edge of the machine, trembling with restrained energy. His skin shimmered faintly with green lightning, sparks drifting upward from him like fireflies in reverse. His eyes twitched beneath heavy lids, darting back and forth as though tracking shapes only he could see. Every time his muscles jerked, the hum inside me tightened. The machines hit full speed as we crashed toward the ruins. The pale defenders scrambled, forming uneven lines behind broken walls and shattered machinery. Their rifles fired weak bolts of energy that splashed harmlessly against our armored hulls. Others held makeshift explosives that rattled nervously in their thin hands. Their eyes were wide with fear, yet their postures carried a strange stubbornness. They stood not because they believed they could win, but because something behind them demanded that they try. The boss raised his shooter and fired one thunderous round into the sky. The shot cracked across the ruins like lightning splitting stone. The mob answered instantly, roaring as one, their voices rising in a frenzy of pure momentum. I felt their roar slam into my chest like a hammer blow. The hum surged in response, threading through their voices, lighting up the air like invisible fire. We leapt from the machines before they even fully slowed. The ground rushed up to meet us in a burst of dust and debris. My boots struck earth hard enough to shake my legs, but the impact only fed the fire swelling beneath my ribs. The defenders ahead lifted their weapons, their hands shaking. Energy bolts cracked through the air. One grazed my shoulder, burning a shallow line across my skin, and the sting of it widened my grin. The mob surged forward in a tide of green muscle and jagged steel. I ran with them, my axe cutting through the wind in heavy arcs. The roar of my lungs mingled with the roar of engines slowing behind us. Dust billowed upward as the first line of defenders met our charge. Their rifles snapped with frantic energy, but the shots barely slowed the mob. A large orc beside me seized the nearest defender by the neck and slammed him into a rusted pillar, shattering the metal with the force. I crashed into two defenders at once. One raised a knife that sparked as it met the edge of my axe. The clash sent a satisfying jolt up my arm. I shoved forward, driving him back until his feet slid across the dirt. The second tried to swing a rifle like a club, but I twisted, ducked, and let the momentum carry him past me. My axe found its mark. The weight of it split through armor and bone with a noise that felt like a door slamming shut. The hum flared as the blade connected, bright and sharp. All around me the battle erupted into a storm of motion. Orcs tore through the defenders with unstoppable force, their laughter rising in manic crescendos as each strike fed the rising energy. The weird boy's lightning crawled across the air, leaping from one orc to the next, crackling with dangerous beauty. Each bolt sent the hum spiking, filling the ruins with a sensation of barely controlled wildfire. The defenders broke quickly, retreating deeper into the Manufactorum ruins, but the mob chased them eagerly. I followed, stepping over broken gear assemblies and shattered glass, passing towering structures that hummed faintly with dormant power. The ruins felt old, ancient, even shaped by hands, long dead or long gone. Strange symbols flickered on cracked screens. Mechanical arms twitched in spasms as leftover energy surged unpredictably. The air inside the ruins was thick with dust and static, carrying the scent of old metal and something older. The hum was louder here. It threaded through the metal walls, vibrating along the beams overhead. It pulsed beneath the cracked floor, echoed through the pipes spiraling along the corridors. It seeped into the edges of my vision, a flickering, hazy glow that made the air shimmer like heat waves. I blinked hard, trying to clear my sight, but the shimmering didn't fade. It thickened. A defender lunged from behind a fallen column, swinging a sparking blade. I caught the attack with the haft of my axe, twisting sharply and driving my forehead into his skull. The impact crunched, sending him sprawling. As he fell, the shimmering flickered again at the corner of my gaze, a green glow that almost looked like movement, like a pulse of energy responding to the fight. The weird boy's wail echoed through the corridors behind us. It bounced off metal walls, rising in pitch until it seemed to scrape the inside of my skull. The hum answered him, building toward a peak. The air buzzed so intensely that dust rose from the floor without being touched. The mob pushed deeper into the ruins, flooding the narrow corridors with their shouts. Gunfire cracked in sporadic bursts, lost within the thunder of footsteps and laughter. The defenders made their final stand in the largest chamber, a vast hall lined with broken machinery, its ceiling open to the sky, where twisted beams reached upward like skeletal fingers. They stood clustered behind an array of barricades made from scrap metal and shattered crates. Their rifles fired in rapid, desperate bursts. The boss stomped forward, roaring loud enough to shake dust from the rafters. The weird boy staggered beside him, lightning arcing wildly from his staff. The mob surged in behind them, fanning out in a wave of unstoppable momentum. The hum inside me exploded, not in sound, not in pain, in understanding. In an instant, everything felt connected. The orcs around me, the weapons in our hands, the engines cooling outside, the lightning crackling from the weird boy's skin, the roar of the boss, the rising tide of battle, not as a mind, not as a god, simply as a force, a tide that rose with every footstep, every laugh, every swing of a weapon, a tide that felt ancient and wild, born from motion and noise, and the simple truth that orcs existed to fight. Rumors flicker across the galaxy that orcs tap into, something primal when they gather something unseen, something unspoken. Some whisper that the energy they generate shapes reality in crude, impossible ways. Others claim it's nothing more than instinct and fury amplified through sheer numbers. To orcs, the truth doesn't matter, only the feeling does. And at that moment, I felt it more clearly than breath. Not a voice, not a being, a rising, a surge, a promise. The Warg. I charged with the mob, my axe swinging in heavy arcs that carved through the defender's line. The air crackled with green lightning as the weird boy released a blast that tore through machinery and bodies alike. The boss's gun belched fire, ripping holes through armor and stone. The mob crashed into the defenders, scattering them like dust in a storm. The hum became thunder inside my skull, shaking loose every last thought except forward, forward, into battle, into noise, into purpose. When the last defender fell, the chamber shook with the mob's laughter. The sound rolled through the ruins, echoing off metal walls, rising into the open sky like a challenge thrown to the horizon itself. The hum dulled into a warm throb, settling beneath my skin like a heartbeat that wasn't wholly mine. I stood in the center of the ruined hall, chest heaving, axe dripping, eyes fixed on the distant sky. Smoke drifted upward in lazy spirals. Sparks crackled from broken machinery. The weird boy collapsed to one knee, twitching with leftover lightning. The boss lifted his axe in triumph, roaring into the wind. And for a moment, the world felt impossibly vast. Not because of landscapes or stars or distant wars whispered about by fleeing enemies, but because the momentum didn't end here. Orcs didn't conquer. They didn't stop. They didn't claim. They moved, always forward, always louder, always toward the next fight. The hum inside me pulsed once more, soft, satisfied, hungry. The war was not finished, and neither was I. We stepped out of the ruins into the open light as the smoke parted before us, and the machines revved their engines once more, calling us to mount up. The eternal laugh rose from the mob as we climbed aboard. Endless war stretched before us, and with every step, every roar, every strike of my axe, the tide inside me grew stronger, guiding me toward the sound of battles yet to come. The Warg whispered again, and I listened.